Welcome to another episode of MiniQuest 64. My name is Sergey, and today we paint the Dwarf Cannon and Crew from the old Warhammer Fantasy starter set Battle for Skullpass. I painted the exact same model 2 years or 3 years ago, which gives me the wonderful opportunity to paint it again and compare my new model with my old one and see how much I have improved, or if I just didn't. So at the end of the video we will have a bunch of pictures you can judge and tell me which one looks better. If you are a beginner, please don't be afraid of all the different and many colors we are using and all the things we are going to do. You can change the colors or even cut them, as well as entire parts of this tutorial. Paint as many layers as you want. Stop after dry brushing and leave out some detail work. The models will still look pretty. It's totally up to you. This is our little cannon. And here you can see our crew, which consists of 3 members as always. We start with some cork and the bases. I ripped the cork into a fitting piece and glued it on to the 60mm base with a lot of superglue. I got this old Dwarf Warrior sprue, which has a lot of interesting parts for us. Then I clipped some sprues to carve some wooden pegs with a hobby knife and form a small fortification around the cannon. Make sure to walk carefully and carve away from your fingers. Cut a small piece at the bottom to get the necessary angle. That should prevent the stupid Greenskinz from taking over my cannon. Now, let's do some kitbashing. I think the banner would fit nicely and the pole can be used too. A shield with a dwarven symbol is always good, and the little mask can be attached on the cannon to make it more interesting. I removed all the mold lines carefully and cut off the hand from the pole and shield. Careful now, we don't want to hurt ourselves or damage the pole. Then I made a little hole into our cork and put the pole into it. A lot of superglue will make sure that everything stays in its place. The shield could be from one of the crew members. I put him on the edge of the base. I got some old earrings from my girlfriend, which should have some right-sized balls that could be used as cannonballs. The holes can be filled with some green stuff later on. I glued everything on the base with some superglue in form of a staple. Now we cover our bases with a thick coat of pure PVA without water. The glue is thick enough to even cover these big slots. Into the sandbox and good to go. We repeat the step on our round base too. Make sure to fill all the gaps and take your time doing so. Let's get rid of these little holes now. The best way would be to mix a little bit of green stuff, put that inside and then shape it with a wet silicone brush or any other kind of hobby tool. After everything has dried completely, we cover everything in a heavy watered down mix of water and PVA to keep everything in place. This will need some time to dry, and because of that we continue with painting our dwarfs. For the priming step, without the bases, I took a piece of plywood and simply glued the minis onto it. The old sculpts are not to be underestimated. They are full of details and materials, and sometimes it's really hard to figure out what exactly you are painting or where it belongs to. I will try to show you all the different parts while painting and switching from one crew member to another. If you have some pre-painted models and would like to strip them, check out my video about how to strip models. Here you can see a list of all the colors I am going to use, and we start our mini quest by priming our miniatures, first with some Chaos Black and then Lead Belcher. The minis were all glued onto some painting handles with a tiny bit of super glue, which makes sure they can be removed easily once we are finished painting. Our first color will be Nuln Oil, and it's a pretty simple task to cover all the metal parts of the minis with it. If you are unsure which the metal parts are, just cover the whole mini. Next up, we take some silver and take a dip with a soft makeup brush. Then we get rid of the majority of paint on a paper towel or MDF wood, which I prefer. We continue to dry brush all the minis carefully. Caliban Green is our next color. We cover all the fabric parts of the dwarfs in 2 thin coats. I'm working on all the minis at the same time and will show you some painting steps and results on each and every one of them. We continue with Mood Green. I put some on my wet palette right beside the Caliban Green and drag a tiny amount into it. After each layer I painted, I continue to increase the amount of Mood Green while painting less surface with each layer. Decide where your highlight will be and paint towards that by pulling your brush into that direction. As a beginner, layering can be very tedious and exhausting. Try to find a good spot between quality and quantity. The more layers you paint, the smoother the transitions, but the more time it will take. If you are more advanced, you could use also wet blending to reduce the amount of layers or paint some textures on the fabrics. We continue to paint this way until our color is so bright that we can use Mood Green on its own. You can also use it to do some edge highlights now. I think the bottom line of the dwarf kilt is a great spot for edge highlighting. For the last highlights, we mix another color into our Mood Green, and I find a yellow tone to be the best way to create intense and warm green tones. Therefore, I used some gold yellow and created some final highlights. We are now finished with the green fabrics and our minis should look something like this. Deathworld Forest is our next color, and we apply 2 thin base coats on the sleeves of the dwarfs, but only 2 of them have sleeves. Then we take some Nurgling Green and start layering again like we did before with the kilt. Increase the amount of Nurgling Green while painting less and less surface. Imagine a light source from above and put the layers on all the spots the light would hit. If you struggle with that, try to take a flashlight. Hold it above the mini and take a picture as reference. Some final layers with pure Nurgling Green. And now we can wash everything with Estonian Camo Shade. That should already be good enough for tabletop standard. If you still want to improve on that, you can take your Nurgling Green again and put some more layers on top. If that's still not bright enough, you can take a brighter green or just some kind of white and mix it into our Nurgling Green to create some very bright final highlights. Finished the sleeves. Next up are all the leather parts, which will be base coated with 2 thin coats of Rhinox hide. At this point, you also want to paint more carefully and don't ruin our already painted parts. So take your time while painting, especially with dark colors. I decided against black boots and painted them brown too, to reduce the complexity of this tutorial a little bit. Before we continue though, we take Celestra Grey and paint the cannon stuffer, or whatever this thing is called. Now we are ready to take our Nuln Oil again and wash the cannon stuffer and all the leather parts. After some time of drying, our minis should look somehow like this. You can totally stop painting the leather at this point. If you want to continue and create some more texture in simple ways, grab your Doombull Brown and start stippling on the most worn out leather parts, as well as some edge highlighting. Here you can see how I painted the leather bag in 20 seconds, to get an idea of how I approach this kind of painting. Every mini though has some different leather parts, like the big gloves or the stripe at the cannon stuffer. That looks better already, and it's up to you if you want to stop here or continue with some final details. If you would like to improve the leather, get some Ushabti bone, a small brush and start to paint some textures in form of small scratches, edge highlights and stippling on all the worn out leather parts. This takes a little practice, but if you make a mistake, you can still cover it with some Rhinoxide or Doombull Brown. Now we have finished all the leather parts. Before we continue with the metal parts though, we take some Abaddon Black and dry brush from the top of the cannon stuffer to the bottom, so that the top looks dirtier than the rest. Next up is some Avalanche Sunset, which we use to paint the stripes on the kilt and shirt. Avalanche Sunset is a yellow color that covers pretty good, so you shouldn't have to paint more than 3 coats to get an even layer. When everything has dried, we can continue by washing all the yellow parts with some Cassandra Yellow, which should leave some kind of orange tone in all the recesses. And again, if you are satisfied, just stop right here and continue with the next part. If you want to improve on that, grab your Avalanche Sunset again and start edge highlighting and layering all the yellow parts again. As soon as you got 2 layers down, you can take a brighter yellow like Fleshgate Yellow, mix it into our Avalanche Sunset and repeat the steps, but focusing on all the sharp edges and corners of the minis. Nothing special here, it's the same layering we already did before with the kilt and sleeves. Some final layers with pure Fleshgate Yellow. Be careful though with the fabric pattern this guy has. And you already know the drill, another final layer with a mix of dead white and Fleshgate Yellow for the final highlights. We finished the yellow parts at this point and can continue with the skin. And what color would be more fitting than the wonderful dwarf skin color Bugman's Glow? Luckily there isn't much skin to paint on these dwarfs since they didn't take this layer oath yet, so concentrate on the lips, face and hands and give him the Asmongold experience. Reichland Flesh Shade will be used next, simply wash all the skin parts. Good enough for tabletop standard I would guess, but we continue with a mix of Bugman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone and start layering again, increasing the amount of Cadian Flesh Tone into our mix while painting less and less surface of the skin. For the highlights, concentrate on the knuckles, nose, lips, cheeks and bald head. Make sure your paint is thinned down properly while painting skin, and paint 2 thin coats. You will notice if your paint is too thick if you can see your brush strokes on the miniature. Now we start to get some volume on the skin, and we continue layering with pure Cadian Flesh Tone. Again, 2 thin layers. If you struggle to get the details down properly, maybe because you are shaking or for whatever other reason, check your hands and positioning. Make sure your light is bright enough. Daylight would be the best since it doesn't change the color appearance. Your mini holding hand should be laying on the desk or any other kind of steady surface, while your painting hand is pressed against your mini hand. This way you eliminate most of the shaking and only move the fingers that hold the brush, so minimal contact with the mini. In the last part of painting the skin, we brighten our Cadian Flesh Tone with some white color like dead white and place some final highlights on the spot where the light would be the brightest. We continue with Abaddon Black, which will be used to paint the weapon handle of this little hammer, as well as base coating one of the beards. Then we continue with painting all the eyes. I tried to make a little sketch that explains the process. First, you position your mini in a good angle so that you can paint a single black line where the eye would be by pulling the brush towards you. Then you take some white and try to paint a smaller line into the black one. In the next step, you take a black again and paint a vertical line in the middle of the white stripe. If you are fancy, you can take a small brush for a final white dot into the black iris as a reflection of light. We continue to paint the beards, and since one of them is already black, we take two colors we have already used, like Celestra Grey and Rhinoxide, and base coat the other two. Then we can wash the beards with Nuln Oil, except the black one. Make sure you got all the hair, beards and eyebrows. They are sometimes hidden in parts you wouldn't expect them. Since we are already using Nuln Oil, I washed some metal parts again to bring up some more details like the rune on the cannonball. For the first details on the beards, we use the base color and a second brighter one, like Dead White and Abaddon Black, to create many variations of grey while dry brushing carefully. We repeat the process for the brown beard with Rhinoxide and Shabti Bone. I think beards that are colored differently are an easy way to get some color variation into your troops, as well as a grey beard with Celestial Grey and Dead White again. The different colors shouldn't be a problem since we already have them on our white palette. If you're fancy, you can take a small detail brush and paint some single hairlines onto the beard by pulling the brush towards you and using the edge of the brush for edge highlighting. A light grey color for our black beard, pure white for the grey one, and a Shabti Bone for the brown beard. The only parts left now are the metal ones, and our first color will be Retributor Armor, which will be used to paint all the dwarf medals, runes, weapons, tools and jewelry. Let me show you each piece here. A little advice here: if you're switching between acrylic and metal paints, try to use two different water cups so the metal particles don't appear in your acrylic paints. Silver again to redo the rivets we've painted yellow, and Nuln Oil to wash some more metal parts and create more color variation between them. This is a great way to make the metal look darker without having to buy additional metal paints. If you need a tip for metal paints, I bought the Model Air metallic colors from Vallejo for about 16 euros and they are great. We continue with our first contrast paint, Gilliman Flesh, that will be painted all over the golden parts. You could use Agrax Earthshade or Reklan Fleshshade too, depending on the overall look you want to accomplish. The final highlights for the golden parts will be painted with some Liberator Gold. Search for spots where the light would hit your golden parts and place some of this color on that spot. Since the metal color already reflects light, this should be easier than with acrylic paint. The same process will be used for silver and all the metal highlights, which are placed the exact same way. If you made it this far, congratulations, your dwarf crew is now finished, and we continue with the cannon. But don't worry, you have already completed the most difficult parts of this tutorial. You can paint the cannon pretty fast and easy. Just smash some gold on all the runes or leave the cannon after dry brushing just as it is. That will be good enough for tabletop. I wanted to create some kind different version with different metals and something like a hardened body part of the cannon and hardened wheels that look different than the other metals, as well as some old parts the dwarfs could have gathered in one of their many expeditions into the old Forgotten Realms. Warblock Bronze is our first color. This will cover our old dwarf parts gathered in expeditions. Make sure to shake the pot really good and paint 2 layers. I accelerated the drying process with a hairdryer between each step so that we can quickly move on to use the technical color Nihilak Oxide and cover all the parts we painted with bronze before. You have to be quick using this. The next step is to take Balthazar Gold, a makeup brush, and some heavy dry brushing on all the parts we covered with Nihilak Oxide before. Try to rotate your brush in circles while doing so. I chose this black metal paint to paint all the metal parts that should be hardened, like the main cannon frame and wheels. 2 thin coats should be more than enough while avoiding the other parts of the cannon. Gunmetal is the equivalent of lead belcher, and I used it to clean the parts that were hit while dry brushing. Here you can see all the parts we painted so far. Next up is Retributor Armor again, and I'll show you all the parts I chose for the golden paint, like the runes, patterns, ignition mechanism, levers, eyelets, gears and wheels. It looks a little too multicolored and dull right now, but that will change once we apply our Gilliman flesh on the golden parts again. Much better and warm. Because we cleaned the metal parts with gunmetal before, we have to wash them again with Nuln Oil. The black metal can be washed too, but try to avoid anything else. And like the last time we painted gold on the dwarfs, we use Liberator Gold for all the highlights on the golden parts. Finally, some silver for all the edge highlights, nuts and bolts. And now we've finished our cannon, and I like this color combination very much. The oxide gives an old touch without looking damaged like rust would do. I removed all the minis from their painting handles, clipped the plastic stripe off the bottom and repainted the underside with some Abaddon black to get rid of the metal look. For our bases, I chose Chaos Black as first and Mechanical Standard Grey as second primer. And that's how they look after some drying time. You already guessed it, Nuln Oil will be next and we wash the ground of all the bases. That will need some time to dry though, especially the big one. But after everything got the time to dry, we can continue with a lot of dry brushing, starting with Dawnstone and a heavy dry brush. Then we continue with Ulthuan Grey and a slightly lighter dry brush using less force. And finally a very light dry brush of Dead White, where we focus on the sharpest edges of the base. At this time we can glue the doors onto the base using some super glue, but not the cannon though, that will be done later. Dryad bark will be used next for the wooden pegs. After 2 coats though, we add some Karak stone on the top and put a layer of dryad bark right next to it. Then we clean our brush quickly and mix those 2 colors on the miniature itself. That is called wet blending. Repeat that on every wooden peg one side after another, working fast because otherwise the paint will dry. Our second contrast paint, Whitewood, will be used next on all the wooden pegs. That should darken everything down pretty heavy, and as long as it's drying we can use gunmetal again to paint the dwarf shield and cannonballs, which will be washed with Nuln Oil in the next step. Then we pick up Karak stone again and dry brush all the parts of the wooden pegs. We continue with dry brushing Dead White and less force, only dry brushing the top of the wooden pegs. Pegs done, now let's base coat the banner with some Caliban green. After 2 thin coats and some drying time, we take a really soft big bushy makeup brush and return with some mood green. Make sure there isn't too much paint loaded and dry brush very carefully every part of the banner. You can also use mood green for some edge highlighting on all the edges of the banner. We continue edge highlighting with a mix of mood green and Flash Kids yellow, getting brighter with yellow and focusing on the sharpest edges of the banner. Then we take Everland Sunset and start to paint the pattern the same way we did the yellow fabric on all the dwarfs. So after 2 coats we wash everything with Cassandra yellow and return with Everland Sunset and some layering until we mix in some more Flash Kids yellow and repeat the process until we are able to use Flash Kids yellow on its own. Now we finish the pattern and take Abaddon black to paint the horizontal and vertical part of the banner pole. Time for some gold. You should be familiar with the gold painting process by now, I think. We base coat all the dwarf medals and symbol on the sheet with Retributor armor. This time though, we use Warpblock Bronzer 2 for the other kind of rune medals on the right side of the banner bag and big one on top of the front side. Gunmetal next for the rest of the metal parts, like on the pole, the rune chain and hammer with wings on top. If you like, you could also dry brush the cannonballs. Next up, we wash all the metal parts, the metal ones with Nuln Oil and the golden parts with Gilliman Flesh. While that is drying, we can take Balthasar Gold and paint all the dwarf runes on the medals we painted with Warp Block Bronze before. For the final highlights on the runes, we can mix some silver into our Balthasar Gold and continue with a single shiny layer as well as some edge highlighting. As a last step, we use Liberator Gold and paint a final layer on all the golden parts. As well as some silver for the final highlights on all the metal parts. Way too late, I recognized that I forgot to paint the leather stripes on the runes and medals. Now, for the banner, I wanted to recreate this symbol from the Dwarfhold Karas a Karak, which is also known as Everpeak or Pinnacle of the Mountains. It is the capital city of the Dwarf race and High King Thorgrim Grudgebearer's seat of power. I'm doing this completely freehand and the next 4 minutes are dedicated to that, so if you're not much into freehand and don't want to know how to do that, you can just skip this part. And if you would like how I did it, well, let's do it. I took Abaddon Black as first color. If you have some problems with brush control, you can use a very light grey like Ulthuan Grey instead. While painting the outlines of the symbol, I looked at the monitor in front of me where I had a reference picture open. Take your time and be precise while painting. Every brushstroke should be well calculated, especially in the first layer. After the first layer was done, I used black to widen the lines a bit. The 3 circles though are a reference to the cannonballs. The only other color we are going to use is dead white. I put some on my wet palette and dragged a tiny amount of white into my Abaddon Black, creating a very dark grey tone. Then I painted all the spots where I wanted the highlights to be. And after each layer, I increased the amount of dead white a little bit before painting another layer. You can see how careful and slow I'm painting. The symbol though is beginner friendly, only requiring you to paint some straight lines. You could also use some Citadel grey tones like Mechanical Standard Grey, Dawnstone and Ulthuan Grey and so on. But not everyone has those colors available, and it can be pretty expensive to get all of these as a beginner. Black and white on the other hand are always available. So it's much cheaper doing it this way. The only downside is that it's harder to reproduce the exact color you mixed in your wet palette if you want to paint many models over a couple of days, which we won't do when painting a banner. I'm getting pretty bright right now, and that means that the surface we are painting is reduced to a tiny spot and will reduce further on. Feel free to stop at any time if that's nothing you can enjoy, or if you already are satisfied with the look. Way too late, I realized that it could be cool if I would show you my wet palette and how I mix the colors. I guess for the future I should get a second camera for that reason. This way it's pretty hard, because I have to edit the focus on my webcam all the time to get a sharp image of my painting process. Painting freehand on banners is something I miss in the actual new releases of Warhammer Age of Sigmar. It seems to me like banners are no longer part of the armies. In the past, people would also print some stuff on paper, cut that out and glue it on a pole. That was funny and beginner friendly too. I hope to get better at this stuff further down the road. Just look up some banner freehand or general freehand. People can create such beautiful art on such small pieces, like in the big Titans of 40k. And it's always an eye-catcher seeing a piece with freehand on the battlefield. The whole process of painting my stupid little symbol on this banner took me 12 minutes. I tried to cut that down as much as possible without losing some steps in between, and that was pretty hard. If you would like an uncut version of this painting, let me know in the comments and I can upload that too. I won't make much of a commentary on that though, the voiceover for this video alone took me my whole Sunday, and it's one of the most exhausting things for me in the whole video creation process, because I have to write a script without repeating myself too much, but being educational and entertaining at the same time, while English isn't even my native language. So I really appreciate you watching this. Now let's do some basing stuff. I got this Vallejo Snowground texture, which I haven't used before, so I'm very excited to try that. The goal is a snow themed base with some dried tufts and leaves. I watched a video about the stuff and how to use it. You'll find the link in the video description. It is pretty simple though, just smash some on your base and spread it all around, using some hobby tools or brushes to create the texture you are looking for. I started with the dwarfs to get a feeling for this new medium. You can't do much wrong on these tiny bases. While the snow was still wet, I added some leaves. I just grabbed them with some tweezers and pushed them into the snow. The same could be done with the tufts, but I didn't want to overload the dwarf bases, so I kept it simple. After the dwarf bases were done, I felt confident enough to proceed to the big one. We are going to need a lot of snow here. The reason I looked for an alternative for the Citadel Snow Valhalla Blizzard in the first place was because it was pretty expensive, while delivering only a small amount of snow. This base alone would just take me 3 pots of that stuff, so I'm pretty happy about this alternative. I got to mention that this kind of basing is really great to cover some mistakes, like the cannonball dance. While cleaning the rim of the base though, the black color was immediately removed and I had to repaint that, which wasn't a big deal, but I wanted to tell you that. Now, as a last step, I used some Agrax Earthshade and put it on the bases and snow, in every place the dwarves has stepped on or the cannon has been moved. This will give everything a dirty but fitting look, I guess. Just make sure to clean all your tools immediately after you're done using them. This model was painted in 2 days on a weekend, so I would say it is possible to paint this model pretty fast. So let's have a look at all these models and tell me in the comments what you think about them.